The Princess and the Crooner. What is the true story behind this latest revelation? Hi, good morning, Neil Short here in the heart of London, and that is your story coming out of London today. Now let me give you a little bit of background to this particular story, simply because we're talking about a crooner who was incredibly popular in the early 1950s, and it was here apparently in London where, according to him, he undertook an affair with a member of the British royal family. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this particular person from the British royal family was, of course, well, used to controversy, and more importantly didn't mind hitting the papers sometimes for all the wrong reasons. Now the princess I'm speaking about is of course a person who I mentioned earlier in a video, who I was lucky enough to meet and spend some time with. But equally on this particular story I was also able to meet the three main players. Now who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the 1950s crooner Eddie Fisher. Now Eddie Fisher possibly is best known now for being married for a brief period to the golden star of Hollywood, Dame Elizabeth Taylor. But way back in 1953 he was just another pop star, well, one to rival an already huge pop star, Frank Sinatra. Now Eddie was in town staying at the Dorchester Hotel no less, but he'd also got rooms booked at the Savoy Hotel. Why? Now here's where the story gets rather interesting, simply because, as I say, Eddie was in town appearing for a 2-week stint at the London Palladium. This was where they decided, now you've got to remember this is the 1950s, but they decided to bring over pop stars to try and fill theatres that weren't really being filled. A little bit like today, right? So apparently Eddie Fisher caught the eye of Princess Margaret. Now apparently they met many times, including here at Kensington Palace where he came for tea. Now the rumours of an affair really started to circulate, I would suggest, by Eddie's PR of the time. Remember, he had a huge rival, as I say, with the likes of other people knocking around at the time, like Perry Como, Mel Torme, and of course everybody was fighting the one and only Frank Sinatra to make sure that you got column inches. Frank was winning simply because he, of course, was married to the delectable Ava Gardner. But Eddie Fisher himself told me the story when he came over on one of his very last visits to London to publicise his book. Now Eddie was a little bit down on his luck, and of course people didn't really remember who he was. Simply really he'd peaked, well, too early almost. But I was also able to become friends with his daughter Carrie Fisher and of course his first wife, Debbie Reynolds. Now Debbie was very spiky herself and kind of gave her sort of twists on stories of the golden era of Hollywood. What was really interesting, I felt, was that Debbie wasn't bitter or twisted about this particular, well, story. What she really liked was this. Debbie stated to me that while Eddie Fisher, of course, wasn't exactly her #1 favourite pin-up anymore ever since he left her holding the babies to, well, frolic off with Dame Elizabeth Taylor, she had managed, of course, to get some semblance of friendship. But Carrie Fisher herself told me on a visit to London also that this story was true, simply because she says that when Princess Margaret attended a very special Star Wars premiere, I believe it was The Empire Strikes Back, she basically said that along the line she could see Princess Margaret, and she made a remark to one of her co-stars about this. Now you have to remember that in the golden era of Hollywood there were lots of people back and forth trying to spin stories, keep people in the headlines, but these particular stories, particularly associated with the royal, wouldn't have sat very well. Now Debbie Reynolds herself told me this. She said that Eddie told her that simply they became friends, he was rather enamoured with her, but of course he felt that he was way too rough and unsavoury for someone of Princess Margaret's stature, but apparently she flirted with him openly in Kensington Palace. That's allegedly where it stopped. But the stories kept going on and on, simply because there were rumours of late night attendances by Princess Margaret to the Dorchester. But when you look at her sort of track record of the difficulties that she had with lovers, friends, and of course just ongoing life, being a very busy princess in the 1950s, and more importantly, a socialite too, there are no records that show that she disappeared in the middle of the night. But then again, perhaps they're now lost in time. It remains to be seen, as I always say on the show, who you want to believe. For me, I personally think it's a great PR story that kept Eddie Fisher in the limelight in the latter part of his years. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, that really no story, particular royal, is really brand new. They just get regurgitated with the main players sort of shifting around. Whichever story you believe, it's kind of interesting to think that Princess Margaret did entertain the likes of somebody like Eddie Fisher. Neil Short in the heart of London.